to kick us off, we're talking about sharing stories, we're talking about sort of normalising conversation and behaviour, we're talking about bringing people together, and we're talking about, I think, probably principally enabling behaviour change. So let's unpack behaviour change a bit more. How can community sustainability hubs better influence people's behaviour when compared with larger government ad campaigns, for example, and open their eyes to different choices? And then probably to the panel a little bit more as well, how have you worked with people before on projects and empowered them to make better choices?
Well, I suppose from my perspective, I don't think the government has the funding to do the promotional stuff that we've suggested, and also when the government or the council puts out a message, it doesn't try and tailor it to the particular community it's talking to, and certainly not to the different groups in the community that it's talking to. It also doesn't give them a clear way to engage with it and know what the personal benefits are for them if they are a retiree, if they are a parent, if they are a student. And I think that's really, really important. And I think it's important that when we have these hubs, local community groups or charities are going to have ownership over them, so they will know what the issues are, they will know the different groups to reach out to. And I think in my experience, as I said, often government and councils do put out things, and then everyone's angry and cynical about it. They think they're getting backhanders or whatever. And actually, a lot of the time, there's a very good reason to put in a school street or to stop idling or whatever it is. That just needs to be communicated effectively, and that really hasn't been done so far, because I could tell you most of the people I spoke to around the shopping centre didn't have a clue as to how the environment was relevant to them in any way, shape or form.
Yeah.
They didn't believe it was relevant to them and their families, and that's bonkers, because each of our, even if you don't have children, it's relevant to you, so it's just about sort of tailoring and personalising the message and making it feel like it's peer-to-peer, so it's people like you, not some expert telling you what to do. But those peers have actually, read into it, and they are linked to the different charities and NGOs who have that expert information, and are sharing their own stories, showing that they're doing it. So I think that's really different from a government or council telling you to do something.
Absolutely, yeah. Marie, how have you sort of dealt with these in your work?
I'm actually going to not talk about what the work we've done, but just touching on what you mentioned. I don't know if anybody listened to Barack's speech on Monday at the adaptation mitigation aspect of COP26. And there's a lot of things he said, but one thing he particularly said that I wrote down was that we need to reframe the message in a manner that people either understand or respond. And it's so key. So if whatever work you're doing, particularly within the community, within the work I do with the marginalised or working with children, their voices aren't being heard. If a child needs a play area, they might say, great, can't you see that slide? I used a slide like that when I was a child. Why doesn't it work for you? But if you're able to actually reframe it to actually understand the impact it has on them. So when we work with businesses trying to get corporates to engage in the conversation, but also support the children to be able to have play spaces. We change the conversation around. So the message, and to be honest, the message can be, this looks good for your business. It's good for your social value. It's good for your bottom line. It's good for your CSR. It's also providing more green space. Fantastic. You've reframed the message in a manner that they understand, because in reality, COP26, net zero, all these challenges we've had for so many years didn't just start today. Now the conversation's been reframed. You've had things such as COVID-19, etc. Everyone's listening, everyone's watching David Attenborough more. People are hearing the stories, people are engaging more in that conversation, and now they're changing their mindset. So for me, a lot of it is to do with messaging, and messaging in the right manner that communicates value to the person you're speaking to. And in play, that means you have to speak to the people who are going to invest. And children haven't got the money to make their own play space. So speak the language.
I'm definitely coming back to play next, because I want to talk some more about that. Camilla, how are you?
Yeah, I think Parisa, your initiative is really admirable, and there's a lot that can be achieved through having better conversations with people and communities. And from the urban design practice, we see as well that when we talk to communities about what they need, there's nothing that really compares to giving them the experience of what a different kind of lifestyle could be, what a different urban environment could look like. Working with tactical urbanism projects, you can talk to people about whether they would like a playground instead of a parking lot, and they might say no, because in their experience a parking lot is what's useful for them. But if you, for the course of a weekend, even just a day, actually enable play in that space instead of having the car parking there, and then you use that as a catalyst to talk to people about how that experience feels, it becomes a way to bring people on the journey of change. It becomes a way to actually show people a different way. But I think we haven't been good enough as designers and urban planners, and I'm not a politician, but I don't think the politicians have been good enough either at actually giving people the choices that will enable them to live sustainable lives. I think we've made it incredibly hard for people to live conveniently and sustainably at the same time. And to me, that's one of the biggest challenges we have ahead of us. It is really closing that gap. I'll bring David into the conversation there as well.
From your work, that idea of giving people a choice between convenience and sustainability, that feels like it has a lot of connection to your research in terms of streets and in terms of how people go about their lives. Can you talk a bit more about your work in that respect? And behaviour change?
I'll do that. I also wanted to sort of touch on a point from Parisa as well, just on, you're saying, children kind of got you into this, and climate strikes and Fridays for Future actually inspired you to get into this. I think some of the work we do, and I'll talk about sort of the community-focused stuff and then maybe some of the research after, we actually just find giving them the pen is the best way sometimes. So, and literally, we've got a workshop today, actually going on right now in Chatham with this amazing local group, and one of our team did a kids charrette, kids co-design event, which basically the kids came back and were like, we don't have any space that we feel we can play in on the high street, so we have this concept of like a kids' high street. But also it goes beyond, I think, sustainability. I think children know what they're doing there, but actually just what should a place look like? If you ask them to draw their ideal home or whatever, it tends to look sort of quite sensible for the area and quite real. So I thought that was amazing. And then I guess coming into some of our research, you're right, it's not, we've made it really hard to sort of live a happy, a healthy, a sustainable life by some of the sort of places we've designed, I think, over the past 60 years or so. And a lot of our research is how can you make development and help create development which is popular and which isn't sort of done at you, but it's done by the community. And I'll come back again. We're in a room with blank pieces of paper. You've got to be kind of real about the constraints and this is the finances. We might not be able to get a basketball court on the roof here, but what can we achieve? And then what should it look like? And let them draw and let them sort of take the lead on it.
But I think also innovation in design has a big role to play as well, and I'm not sure we have been good enough at pushing the boundaries of what we can achieve. And if what we find is that there's a desire within a community for there to be a basketball court, surely we can find a place or a way to implement that. Or we can get smarter in how we understand community needs. Because if you ask people, so in user research and user experience design practices, when you ask people what they need from something, you always have to ask 5 times to dig into the depth of what their actual needs are. Because you might ask people, how do you do your shopping? Well, I need a car. All right, why do you need a car? Well, I need to carry things. How many things? Well, it's because I've got a family. I'm doing my shop once a week. But what you're actually finding out is that people need a quick way to get their groceries on the way home. And once you know that that's the challenge, and they need healthy groceries as well, once you know that that's the challenge, then suddenly your design options just multiply. There's so many more ways that you can actually deliver on that need than just saying we need better vehicular infrastructure. But unfortunately, the way that we have been looking at the problems that we're trying to solve, I think for the past 20, 30, 40 years, hasn't been sophisticated enough. And we've just kind of taken the problems at face value instead of diving into kind of the systemic underlay and finding more innovative solutions.
So to see another idea which has come from the floor, we've someone saying we need more testing and experimentation. So how can these hubs help us embed more testing and innovation in people's habits and people's behaviours, and how, in urban design terms, and through your work, do you think we can embed more testing and innovation in schemes and in our urban lives?
I think it's really important that we're constantly exposing people who are willing, at least, and potentially those who are originally unwilling but then become interested because we frame it in a way that's interesting to them, with testing and innovation, so they feel ownership over it, so they can feed back actual, genuine, useful feedback, which will be different, as we said again, culturally different. It'll be different group to group. It'll, and I think it's important because we want this technology to be mainstream and popular. So we don't want it just to be for some stereotype or another. We want it to be for the older, the younger, every ethnicity, the family, the single person, the retiree. We want people, and even if that means they have to do different versions of it, even if that means they just need to reframe the message around it to explain it in different ways to different groups and how it benefits them, I think it is really important. And I think that hubs like this are really important at attracting a much wider cross-section of the community. And there's things that I want to normalise, for example, the conversation around being a driver, being a cyclist, being a pedestrian, because I'm all of them, and I don't think that there should be animosity between anyone. And I think, that conversation and making sure that everyone is part of that, all the different groups, the same with the testing, it's just something that we need to normalise, that people get involved with. And I think technology is important to go, but we also have to look at the sustainable nature of that, and that there aren't too many downsides of that particular technology. Hopefully it's, sustainable technology.
Please.
I think, just touching on some of the things, often when you talk about testing or innovation, it can actually be quite exclusionary. I think often people don't recognise that there are tools that enable you to access and engage in innovation, or the testing will be of value to you. Innovation, to a lot of people, a lot of the work I do is in innovation, and to some people it's like a dirty word. It's wasted time. It's a test for what purpose? So it's often thinking about I'm talking about language. I do like Barack Obama, but you see, a lot of it is the message and the language you use, and then thinking about what tools have you provided, how are they inclusive. So the work we do, we co-design play spaces with children, and it's bare bones. It's either paper and pencil, or it's CAD, so using technology that enables people to engage in the innovation in an inclusive manner. It may be modelling material. It's accessible materials that speak to them where they're at, and they can see the process of innovation. And the key word about innovation is that it isn't the be-all and end-all, and there's tools that enable you to innovate. So when you're working with communities, it's about it being localised. It's actually understanding that context, and how does innovation look to them? What do local people do to innovate?
Absolutely.
David?
I'm just thinking on sort of testing. One of the key things I'd say is measurement, and so we need to measure more and get way better at that. I was speaking with some of the air pollution teams today in the Green Zone, and we're quite good actually in the UK. I think we could be a lot better at measuring air pollution. But what else should we be measuring in new towns, existing towns? Happiness, health. What kind of metrics? Because otherwise you'll never know if you're going to improve it. And then trial stuff. So. Like the Broad Street Meadows in Oxford, they had a time limited trial, which meant I think they managed to avoid a lot of the opposition from people who were like, I want to park here and this is how it's always been. And they just said, let's trial it. And it has ended, it's finished, they did extend it by a month. But maybe people have experienced that and experienced this space as a kind of green environment, and they might now think, well, okay, can we have this a bit more permanently in place? I think measurement is my key.
In the same way that you could say during COVID-19, suddenly people experience that they can actually, but some people can work from home again. Not everyone has the ability to do so because their living conditions might not be good enough as a working environment, or they might have a job that doesn't enable them to work from home. But there was a large proportion of the working population that suddenly went from thinking that a commute every day was just the status quo and there was no way to changing that, to suddenly realizing that they could stay in their neighborhood maybe a few days a week, and that opened up other opportunities for them to enjoy their environment and connect with their neighbors and their communities and spend more time with their families and their children. And that, in a way, you could have launched that as an experiment without COVID. You could have said, we're going to make everyone who can work from home. Let's try to do that. Let's see what that does to our air quality and our life quality. But it took kind of the pandemic. But now that we've experienced it, it's never going to go back, right? And it's the same with urban design, where we are, and we saw again with COVID, there was a lot of what they called emergency measures, where councils were able to put in temporary bike lanes or temporary sidewalk extensions because it was public health that people needed that space. And now that we've experienced that alternative, it's a lot easier to imagine that being permanent. And I think that's where you call it testing or call it innovation or call it what you will, but I think that the experience, it almost trumps any kind of information that can be conveyed through a conversation.
I wish there had been more though, so that it wasn't like people poisoning planters and stuff, you know. so that the angry minority didn't force some councils to pull things out or be fearful of putting things in, because I think if we could have explained to those people how they personally benefit, whether they're a taxi driver or whether they're just somebody, you know, whoever they are, then I think, you know, hopefully we would have had a different experience. But I agree, having it in there is really important. And one thing about testing and data is that the conversations that we've had with people who work in behavioural science and climate change is that there is a missing link, which is we can ask people, do you think you would get solar panels, or how do you feel about this, how do you feel about that? But what we don't do, and what we haven't done, maybe because it's too expensive, I don't know, but basically is give them an experience of something. Like you can try out the sewing machine, or you can take this bike out, or you could try this smart meter at home, or you can do this workshop, you can do this talk, blah, blah, blah. Ask them after that experience what they think, would they use it in the future? But then 6 months later, follow up and say, okay, these were the 10 things covered in that course, or these are the 3 things that you've done with us. Which of those things did you carry on with, or did you buy? And what were the blockers? Or what was the thing that enabled you to do it? And that sort of follow-up information of real-life data of what actually happened, rather than what people predict they'll do, is really missing. And, you know, we're really hoping that this project will, you know, dig out some of that data, which is so important, not only to, you know, councils and the government, but also obviously to the charities working in this area, and also to, you know, people who are working on decarbonising technology. You know, what are the blockers to different groups of people accessing this and carrying on actually doing it?
I think part of the beauty of the community hub is that you're able to engage with people to actually understand what scenarios we need to focus on. In reality, the working from home scenario is fantastic, but it's also really privileged scenario that a lot of us have been privileged to experience. But in that community, in Bromley, in between McDonald's and Waterstones Entertainer, you'll be meeting people who will talk about issues that you can collect the data on and see what scenarios do we need to test out. And in reality, there's only so much that the government can do, not just in the UK, internationally. It's only so much the government can do. So the community has a place, and you've done such a great work in terms of engaging the community, getting that information, and being able to get that data. And data is there to drive something. So I think that's the key thing. Data is there to drive something. And with community, you can drive early. You don't need to wait until this policy comes out. You've got something, they've done that experience, let's move on. What can we do next?
It's very empowering, and it also means that, you know, the government can feel more comfortable funding things like that once they've got some data that says this actually works and this is how to do it. So then they're not fearful, councils are less fearful, governments are less fearful about putting out these new policies or funding these projects, because they've got data showing actually a bigger percentage of the population does get it and does care about this, and these are what they want to see, so we can do those things without fear.
I think it's so, this conversation about data and measurement is something that is really close to my heart, because I've spent a lot of my career so far trying to measure what matters and figuring out ways that you can value public life alongside how many vehicles you're moving through a road, or what's the value of creating a space in the city that is publicly accessible and that you can spend time in for free even when it rains with your children, and, you know, putting a pound or a dollar value on public amenities essentially, and on civic life. But I'm also just starting to be a bit frustrated with the fact that we're constantly having to justify making choices or making making societal choices and causing societal change that brings us towards more social and environmental outcomes. And because we're always talking about the social, the economic, and the environmental, but the social and the environmental has to be translated into economic terms in order for us to value them. And as long as we're doing that, it's not truly kind of a triangle of measurements. But the language, and this comes back to language and information, the language we have in order to value the experience that a member of a community has when they can sit on a park bench and connect with someone who's from a different generation for them, the language we have to value that, it's just not the same unless I can tell you that, well, you're saving X amount of pounds because of mental health benefits and that interaction. And I think it's sad, and someone pointed out yesterday, someone I spoke to here at COP26 who was from an indigenous community, that when you talk to indigenous communities about putting a pound value on their forests, they just look at you like, but why the forest is valuable? Because it provides us with food and shelter, and protect us from the climate and climatic conditions. Like translating that into, but we, or I say we because I assume we've kind of, I know we've all been through the education system in some part of the developed world. We've just grown up with the monetary value being the thing that that's the lens that everything has to go through. And it's fine to do that for now, but also it would be amazing if something like the Sustainability Hub could also start to create a more nuanced and multifaceted conversation about values with communities, and actually the types of lives that they want to lead. You can't put a dollar value on that.
I think that data side of it is really compelling. I might want to move the conversation slightly onto geography and sort of the setting of these hubs, which I think is really important.
Yeah.
Obviously, on the one hand, we've got the potential of vacant units on high streets. And I know we've all got thoughts around sort of high street renewal and how we can go about that. And this is where we probably find some of our most democratic spaces, most accessible, you might be able to argue. On the other foot, shopping centres where a large proportion of people are and spend their time. And some responding to some messages on the chat there is where we can get everyone involved, where we can engage in placemaking, which, as Robert has said, design with the people and by the people, sort of creating a place and not just design. I think that's really important for locations. So I think what are the opportunities for locations for these hubs? Obviously they've started in shopping centres. Where do you see they could go, and what's the panel's thoughts on other locations?
Well, we have kind of thought about this quite a lot, and the opportunity came up because shopping centres, it's a situation where the charity or the NGO that's running it will have a unit that's empty, but also it'll be one business that you're dealing with who has an ESG and commercial interest in having footfall coming in, and rather than a landlord sort of situation. And also they have security, which can then respond to issues in the hub as well, and they have the money to put in to fund that, $250,000 plus of service charge and rent, whereas often private landlords or councils don't or are not willing to. They see the commercial angle and the social responsibility angle, and they're willing to do that. And actually, LaSalle have said if this goes well, that they would look to roll it out in other shopping centres of theirs, which is really positive. And I think if this goes well, and we have data that shows footfall increases, etc., I'm sure lots of other organisations that own shopping centres will be keen to do it. Now, in Bromley itself, I think most people actually go into the shopping centre. It's very central. It's alongside the high street, but the high street has probably more closed units. And especially in the wet weather and the cold weather, people like being inside the shopping centre. So I think it's a good way to reach people, but also it is important, and we really are keen to make sure that there are satellite events in geographical different parts of the borough, as well as it being with different groups of people. But also we want to identify who are the community groups there, the community leaders there, who can help lead that conversation, rather than it being a central Bromley hub coming in there. It's actually their church minister, or it's their scout group who's doing a collaboration with us, or whoever it is, their food bank, or whatever it is, doing different events in different geographical areas to make sure that we are covering all the different groups in the community.
Yeah.
So it's really, really powerful. David, what about locations in terms of your sort of broader work, and what you think the power and the opportunity is for different locations?
Yeah, I guess we spoke about this earlier, and whatever works for you to get to the most people is probably the first place to start, and what works for your model is definitely the right thing. But other than that, I guess you're looking at where is the maximum number of people crossing, where are your kind of street corners, your squares, your high streets, where you're going to get to the most people and a broad diverse range of people. I'd love to see because I think that could be so useful, rolled out in sort of every high street where you do. I mean, we must have about sort of 17% vacancies in a lot of the high streets, and maybe there's some councils listening in, who actually own a lot of property on a high street, and therefore can kind of take a bit more of a take a loss leader, right, and to get people in, because that's going to benefit the rest of their estate. And actually, it's quite similar to how a lot of the successful high streets work is they might cost a bit more to run than the surrounding areas, but the value that they give, pounds or whatever you want to measure it, is so much greater. So actually, I reckon you probably have luck with some of the great estates in London, actually, because they can maybe see the kind of social value of it. So I wouldn't totally write off shopping centres, but I'm also not going to say, put them in high streets to be all of high streets, because if that works and you can get to 10,000 people every year, then fantastic.
Yeah, it's a case-by-case basis, I guess, as well, because some places they might not have the same situation with the shopping centre, but hopefully between like the McDonald's and the New Look and the Entertainer, like where this hub is, it's quite a good mainstream setting. But you definitely have to look at it case by case.
Camilla, what if you could touch on the idea of we haven't got on to talking about food yet, and I was thinking about we've mentioned the McDonald's, and how do we connect that with our sort of food behaviours and locations for potentially putting these next to transit stops and that kind of behaviour. Behaviour's the wrong word.
Yeah. I think I completely understand the purpose of starting the sustainability hubs in shopping centres. And I think you're right to capture people who are going to McDonald's and to New Look, and you've identified that those are people who may not be engaging in sustainability debates more broadly, or they might not be aware of the health impacts that there are to hanging out at McDonald's and shopping centres. I also think it's really sad that we are at a point in society where the place to have civic conversations about how to collectively improve our sustainability footprint has to take place in such a place that we don't have that our public spaces are not capable of hosting those public debates, and that they're not happening more organically as well. But let's talk in 25 years and see if we've moved there. And I think, Chris, what you were alluding to is that there's been some research done on how a company like McDonald's quite strategically will locate itself next to transport hubs, because that's where people might have 10 minutes and they can pick up a burger really quickly and they can jump on the transport system. And we also know, unfortunately, that the demographic that uses public transport are often people who can't afford to buy a car, because we've created a society where people can afford to buy a car and live in a big house in the countryside. That's typically what they choose to do. And so you've got a demographic who are potentially already slightly disadvantaged. There's loads of people who aren't disadvantaged using public transport, but let's, for argument's sake, say you've got a part of the population that are slightly disadvantaged. They're using public transport. It's their only option of getting from A to B, and McDonald's is right next to it, and they're hungry, and they can get shit food, sorry, I know we're streaming live, for very little money. And that's what they do. And I think that is such a shame that we are allowing, I guess, those kinds of facilities to coexist. But how great would it be if something like the Sustainability Hub was the facility which was next to the transport hub instead, so that you're co-locating the destinations that people need to use with the information that is important to them. And we just did a study actually on 15-minute cities called Close to Home, and in that we found that access to fresh food is the main thing. It's the main thing that people want to have close to home, together with public transport. Fresh, healthy food and public transport. And we know that those amenities are also essential in order to enable people to live healthy lives. And so it would just be so great in this hub if you're also able to have that conversation with people around the location itself of where they are and the choices of where people spend their time and how that affects every other aspect of their lives. I guess you can. I don't like to keep things simple. Let's.
Well, the good thing is we are going to have a community fridge, which will hopefully be reducing food waste and providing fresh food to lots of people. Yeah. And we're collaborating with food banks on lots of things as well.
It's really good. There's certainly more we can talk about in that sort of connection with food. I think anyone with a baking unit and wants to sort of drive genuine community change, then get in touch with Parisa. I just want to bring Marie in for one final thought, because we haven't touched on play.
Okay.
And sort of connected to that geography idea of the potential of these, we all know about forest schools and have probably been working on some forest schools, and actually the potential for sustainability hubs to be based there or even to visit there from time to time and incorporate play. So Marie, play, what role does this have in our learning and how can we use it in sustainability hubs in your idea?
So,
30 seconds.
Oh gosh, 30 seconds. So I'm going to really speak from the perspective of a child and I'm going to be short and succinct. But the main thing is if we did have the hub, it didn't affect play. Encourage play. Because often the challenge would be, it can be that it will be for adults and it will be like an adult space. It has to be fun, it has to be open, there needs to be space for the children to play, there needs to be diversity, and I don't mean diversity just in terms of the props, I mean in terms of like what the people can access it, in terms of what materials are available, because I've got a short amount of time, and I think a really key thing is touching on what you're talking about. We're all talking about often when you're considering a place where you can engage in public activity, for a child it may be play, a key area to focus on is where these unheard voices are able to slow down in a safe manner. So the play space has to be somewhere that is safe and also somewhere that the parents believe is safe for the child to go. I'm going into so much more detail. It's only 30 seconds.
No, it's only 30 seconds and we're over time, and I think it's a really powerful point to end with, so thank you. I think the idea of bringing the global COP26 back to communities and to streets to enable meaningful change through these sort of peer-to-peer conversations feels really important, and I know the panel reflects that and feels it's really important too. So I'll just say to everyone, do get in touch with us for more information and to get involved. If you have a vacant unit and you want to maximise their use, get involved. And of course, if you're a billionaire and want to put your money somewhere very meaningful, do get involved.
And especially if you want to design a great street for people that is also a play street which incorporates lessons about how to live sustainably.
Get in touch.
Get in touch with all of us.
David, Marie, Camilla, Parisa, thank you very much. And a fantastic conversation. And I just want to end by saying a special thank you to Connie, to Jacqueline, and to Robert from the Urban Design Group for making all of us look good and effortless, because these things do not come together easily, and it wouldn't have happened without you three. So thank you very much. You know where you are. And thank you to the audience. Sign up to the UDG Urban Update to never miss a beat. So thanks everyone, speak soon.